Hello there, I'm J-Bone, and you are watching Bad Juju and J-Bone Presents. We have another installment for you to enjoy. This time, we ditched the studio set for some spooky holiday season treats from the best place we could think of. Halloween, Day of the Dead, Anne Rice's funeral procession, parades, decorations, costumes, and most importantly, the people.
Juju. Welcome to New Orleans. Jude Hall, and this is Titles, Talk, and Tipples. It's a very special edition of Titles, Talk, and Tipples, as we are in person live in New Orleans with the author Alex Jennings. Welcome, Alex.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
Yes, it's great to have you. So what are we sipping on today?
This is a margarita. Yes. Quite strong.
Yeah.
But we have a storied tradition of day drinking here in New Orleans, and it's treating me well.
Well, good. Well, cheers. Yes, it's a very good one. So you are the author of Ballad of Perilous Graves.
That's right. It came out in June.
Wow, so pretty recent. It's a beautiful hard copy. I love that cover. It's amazing. I remember that's the first thing I ever saw of it was when you revealed your cover, and it's like, oh my gosh, I gotta get that.
Yeah, it's truly extraordinary. And the thing is, if you look at the cover through Google Lens, it animates it so that the skeletal hands are playing the piano and everything.
Oh, how fantastic.
Really beautiful. I couldn't believe it when they showed me that.
Well, and who did the cover? Was it just...
Her name is Lisa Marie Pompilio. I think I'm pronouncing that right. On Instagram and Twitter, she is Von Brooklyn, and she's amazing.
Yeah. This story, Perilous Grave, is actually a person.
Yes.
Yeah. And was it Perilous Antoine Graves?
Yes, yeah.
And he goes by Perry in the story with his little sister Brendy and their friend Peaches. And that's about as far as I got, with them jumping over the fence of the graveyard. So tell us about your story. I know there's kind of a magical aspect to it.
Right. It's kind of a blaxploitation Pippi Longstocking adventure where their version of New Orleans has music as a form of sorcery, and 9 songs of power have escaped from Professor Longhair's enchanted piano to manifest around the city as colorful street people. And my title character, Perry Graves, a failed magician, has to team up with his baby sister and his true love to catch the songs and return them home before the city crumbles.
Okay. Would you say that it's geared towards adults?
It's definitely geared towards adults.
There was some language I noticed. So.
Right. A lot of the principal characters are kids, but they're put in a very adult situation because when I moved down here in the summer of 2006, I heard and read a lot of stories of kids who were forced to return to the city on their own without their parents and fend for themselves, get themselves fed and to school and everything. And immediately in my mind, that brought up Pippi Longstocking, since, in the books she lived in her own house with her sea captain father away sailing. So that was my way in.
Yeah. And music is a big part of it, which music is a huge part of New Orleans culture. But are you yourself a musician?
I'm not. I am kind of an obsessive music nerd, have been since I was very little. But no, I don't play anything myself.
So now ghosts come up in the story too, right? So talk a little bit about that.
Well, there is a tradition of ghostly interactions in my family. So the spirits of the dead have always been an important part of my life. And I like to handle acephnal tropes as metaphors for the human condition anyway. So ghosts are memories, and the house that they haunt is your body, basically. So it just seemed very natural to me to bring ghosts into the narrative itself.
You've lived in New Orleans for how long now?
16 years, I think. Okay. Yeah, 16 years.
And you traveled around a lot when you were a kid.
Yeah. My father worked for the State Department, so I was born in Germany, raised in Gaborone, Botswana, Norfolk, Virginia, Washington Courthouse, Ohio, Columbia, Maryland, Paramaribo, Suriname, and Tunis, Tunisia.
Okay, wow. So 16 years ago, you moved to New Orleans. What brought you here?
Well, there's a version I tell people and there's a version I don't. I'll sometimes tell people that I was commanded in a dream to move down here, which is more or less true, but I kind of downplay the significance of that in my life a lot of the time. I had a very spiritual experience, like a vision or a revelation, and part of that was telling me to move to New Orleans. And for a long time, I wasn't sure if I had done the right thing, because, New Orleans isn't the easiest city to live in. I do love it more than any other place on earth. But, the infrastructure is kind of crumbling a lot of the time, and there's a lot of corruption and things like that. But what it lacks in those areas, it makes up for with just the sheer vibrance of the community, the warmth of the people, the influence of the culture, and just the ambient creativity that suffuses everything all the time. So after several years, I started writing this book, and by the time I was finished and got it off to market, I realized that this was exactly the thing to do. And it looks like sticking to it has brought some serious rewards to my life. And as always, I'm very glad and grateful to be here.
Yeah. And how did the story come about? Like, were you a writer before this?
Yes, I was a writer before this. I started selling stories in 2005 after having gone to Clarion West in 2003. And I didn't start this book until 2009. It was originally supposed to be a comic, but I had a hard time finding an artist. So I just started doing what I do, and I wrote it as prose. And it was supposed to be something that I could work on quickly and get off to market without having to invest in it too much. But it turned into the great work of my life and like the biggest statement I've ever had to make.
How many pages is that?
I think it's something like 464 or something like that.
That's incredible. So do you have a word count? I know that doesn't mean much to the average person, but for writers, it does mean something.
Well, I know the word count is under 140. I think it's somewhere around like 125 or 130.
Okay, but that's considered epic, right, in industry standards, so that's huge.
Well, I originally conceived the novel as number one in a trilogy, but when we were talking to Orbit about their plans for the book, they really wanted to make it a standalone, and so they tasked me to grow it into a sort of definitive statement on these characters in this world.
They didn't want it to just end on a cliffhanger, and
right.
So people are searching for a book that is a standalone, that the story does get resolved.
Yes.
The characters go through their growth. And will you continue with these characters with some other stories, possibly?
Probably not directly with these characters, at least in this medium. But I will be returning to their world for sure.
Yeah.
And certain minor characters might pop up in other things in larger roles.
Right. It's a great universe you've created.
Oh, thank you.
Based on real world, and it does feel very real world because you talk about real situations like what Hurricane Katrina and the devastation left by it.
Right.
And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, sure.
It's it's a big part of the culture here, right?
It is, and I think for me to write an honest and true love letter to the city of New Orleans, I couldn't ignore the devastation left behind in the wake of the failure of the federal levees and the scars that it's left and the way it's changed the landscape and even the geography of the city. So I'm also very aware that I am a transplant to this city, and the city has been in sort of a pitched battle for its soul for a long time. A lot of people move down here and impose their ideas of other places on New Orleans, and they often wind up taking up space that's not meant for them. So I was very conscious that I did not want to do that at all. So one of the reasons why I set the book primarily in a fantastical version of New Orleans is because I don't want anybody to mistake me as making a definitive judgment on the city and the experience of living here and being from here and having gone through Hurricane Katrina. I did go through Hurricane Ida, but I was enormously lucky in that. I don't know what it's like to lose everything in the way that a lot of folks did in the wake of Katrina. And I do feel like people have accepted the book in the spirit in which I wrote it. But I'm very conscious of not wanting to speak for others or register opinions that are not mine to register, for instance. There are a lot of conversations going on in the city, should Zulu wear blackface? And honestly, I don't have an opinion on the subject, and it's not a subject for me to have an opinion on as someone who moved down here 16 years ago. I mean, they've been running that parade for, so long.
We've heard a lot about the Zulu, and I feel like
well,
they can do what they want. Yeah.
I will say Zulu is my favorite parade, and
our friends too.
Yeah,
it's their favorite.
And the black masking tradition is its own thing, and it's very different from minstrelsy and things like that. So, I say again, I have no opinion on it. It's not my place.
You enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I feel like cultures doing things with their own cultural stuff. That's
right.
Important. All right. So on that note, we're going to take a little break and stay tuned.
Jose Guadalupe Posada, born 1851, died 1913, was a Mexican illustrator known for his satirical and politically acute calaveras. Deriving from the Spanish word for skulls, these calaveras were illustrations featuring skeletons which would, after Posada's death, become closely associated with the Mexican holiday Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Most of these calaveras were published by the press of Antonio Venegas Arroyo, which produced inexpensive literature for the lower classes, including thousands of satirical broadsides which Posada illustrated. Through this focus on mortality, Venegas Arroyo and Posada satirized many poignant issues of the day, in particular the details of bourgeois life and the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. On January 20th, 1913, 3 years after the start of the Mexican Revolution, Jose Guadalupe Posada died at his home in obscurity. He was penniless and buried in an unmarked grave. It was only years later, in the 1920s, that his work became recognized on a national and international level, after it was championed by the French expatriate artist Jean Cholot, who described Posada as printmaker to the Mexican people.
I'm Jude Madelich Hall with Titles, Talk, and Tipples, and we're with Alex Jennings, the author of Ballad of Perilous Graves. And we were talking about the culture of New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina, the influence New Orleans obviously has on this book. And I did want to show the audience some of the incredible... There's this lovely map of part of the city. Making him do some fancy camera work. And so how long did it take you to write this?
About 10 years.
10 years?
Yeah.
Oh, see, I love hearing that, actually.
Well, hopefully the next one won't take as long.
Oh, sure.
But the process of discovering this book aligned with the process of learning New Orleans culture, and how to integrate myself better into the fabric of the city. So a lot of it was born out of a class I took when I was finishing up my undergrad at the University of New Orleans with Connie Sienna Atkinson on the history of New Orleans music. And so that was sort of my way into the antecedents of jazz, learning about the rock and roll era, and it also helped me contextualize a lot of the free-floating imagery and ideas that are important to the city and its life. For instance, we are here in the 7th Ward right now in Faubourg Treme, and this is one of, if not the oldest Black neighborhoods in the entire country. And just down the street at Armstrong Park is Congo Square, where jazz was basically born into the world. And not far from that is a laundromat that used to be Cosimo Matassa's recording studio, where people like Fats Domino and Little Richard basically built the sound of rock and roll that has had such an influence over American history and world history, in fact.
Absolutely.
So everywhere you look, that history and those spirits are alive in the city. And it was very important to me to interact with them respectfully and carefully and express these ideas and what they mean to me in a way that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. So you lived here for about 6 years before you started writing the book?
Yes.
All right. And what your process, I guess?
Well, it did start out as a conversation about what was happening to children in the wake of the storm and how they were living their lives and taking care of themselves. And for more on that, if people are interested, there is a documentary called Katrina Babies that I think aired on HBO that goes into a lot of that more definitively than I ever could, because it's produced and directed and written by someone who actually went through that process, who was born and raised in New Orleans and has seen the effect that Katrina has had over the past, not a whole generation, but a lot of folks are coming of age in the wake of that. I'd say the writing began pretty quickly. I know I at least had a list of characters very early on, in 2009, I think. And, like the rest of it was just figuring out the story, figuring out what it wanted to tell me about itself, figuring out the context, figuring out how it interacted with my own history and my own family lore. A lot of my family appears in this book, even though we are not from New Orleans. Like I've transplanted their personalities and their sensibilities in a lot of ways. And I hope that I've brought that forward faithfully. My family seems to love it, which is a major surprise to me.
That's always good, right?
Yeah. I did realize sort of midway through the writing of the book that the main character, Perry Graves, is based on an unimagined version of my dad at that age.
Okay.
And, I knew how things were going to go in his story, and I was very worried about that. So I honestly wasn't able to write anything for at least 9 months.
Oh.
And, inspiration brought me back to it, and I'm glad I was able to finish it.
That's great. The character of Peaches, she's a pretty magical character. I haven't got very far into the book, so we don't have to give away any spoilers or anything, but Peaches has some abilities.
Yes.
Some magical abilities. That's very interesting. Where did she come from?
She basically came from Pippi Longstocking.
Okay.
So
I was thinking so.
Yeah, I took all the best parts that I enjoyed most about Pippi Longstocking and then kind of combined them with every woman I've ever loved to create this character who's titanically strong, but also vulnerable in a lot of ways, and who is trying to protect the people around her and her loved ones as much as possible, because there's a lot of that in my family, and I'm so grateful for the women in my life.
Lovely. And so you do bring, there's a character, and I apologize, I can't remember the name, even though I read it. You have a transgender character in there. Would you remind me of the name? Casey
Ravel.
Yeah. And so is that a personal part of your life, or is that something you just wanted to bring in the book? It comes in very naturally. Mm-hmm. I really appreciated the way you brought it in. You didn't make it political. You didn't make it weird. It was just it's a very natural part of the story. And we have a transgender child, so it really spoke to me about the way this person came into that and how they experienced it and came into it on their own.
Well, Casey is a full-on deuteragonist in the story. He is living and operating in New Orleans, like a version of New Orleans that's much like ours, but it still has some magic to it. And I have a lot of loved ones who are trans, and they have had such an influence on my life, and I care for them so deeply that it was necessary to me to sort of represent their experience. And again, it was an issue of not wanting to put words in anyone's mouths, not wanting to try to relate the definitive experience of transness in some way, but at the same time to show that. And I guess, to validate what I consider to be the heroism of a lot of trans people that I know and love.
Yeah. And that person, they work in an office setting. So at first it's kind of this, what we associate as a office worker, you're in this little cubicle, you're having to dress a certain way and act a certain way. And
right.
It's a great addition to the story because it's this, you sense the magic pretty early on. And then it's like suddenly you're in this office and it's like, oh, we're back to reality.
Well, I mean, Casey's office and his school are a very real place here in New Orleans. That would be the International High School of New Orleans up the street on Carondelet. That's a place where I worked as a fundraiser for a little while.
Oh, okay. So I was wondering, is that of any interest? Would you like to talk about that? Or
I mean, I can.
Well, and as tedious as it can be, grant writing and being able to do that is it's an important part of our community too in Astoria, Oregon.
It is.
That's how you save buildings and
right.
Things that have existed for a long time, and you keep those traditions strong.
Which is, I mean, it's definitely important to our lives here in the city. Like, there are a lot of landmarks that need preservation. And, it also kind of prepared me for the work that I'm doing now with Con or Bust, which is an organization designed to provide greater access to SF conventions, events, and professional development for creators and fans of color. So that's an institution that helped me a lot earlier in my career. And when they needed somebody to step in and revive the program under Dream Foundry, it was really important to me to grow this program into something that is bigger than any one person and will survive in the field.
And so when you say SF, are you talking
speculative fiction?
Speculative fiction,
yeah.
Yes. So that's science fiction, fantasy, for those that don't know. Mm-hmm. So you are involved, you're not just a writer, you actually have helped to open doors for other people and the
right.
creative process. And
well, it's tremendously important for me to do that because I have experienced a lot of that on my behalf over the years. The whole reason I went to Clarion West to begin with in 2003 is that I happened to meet Octavia Butler when she came to visit my class at the Evergreen State College. And she told me that if I applied to Clarion West, I would get in. And it turned out she was right. And so that was kind of my entree into the field. And that's how I met a lot of brilliant people like Nisi Shawl and China Mieville and Elizabeth Hand.
Yeah.
And like so many of them have helped me out along the way. And so it's very, very important to me to pay that forward as much as possible.
What are you in the process of creating now? Are you writing something new? Oh, I saw that smile.
I mean, I am. I'm working on a lot of things right now. Some I can talk about and some I can't.
Oh, sure.
I'm working on a new novel. I've got several short stories coming out. In fact, I have a short story in the Africa Risen anthology from Tor.com Publications. It's edited by Donald Ekpeki Ogunechowwe, Zelda Knight, and Cherie Renee Thomas. And it's just a beautiful volume, and I'm so happy to have a story in there.
Incredible, yeah. And so with all your travel and your fundraising and your writing, do you think you're going to stay in New Orleans?
Yeah. I mean, I will be here in at least in some capacity for the duration. This is the place where many of the best things in my life have been added to my life. And, the risk of moving down here has paid off in some major ways. And I love this place. This is the city dearest to me in all the world.
It's a very precious place. If someone wanted to get involved with the Dream Foundry, how would they go about that?
Go to dreamfoundry.org, and our page is dreamfoundry.org/con or bust.
Okay. And if someone were to want to follow you and what you are doing, how can they do that?
I'm on Instagram and Twitter as Magic Negro, MAGICKNEGRO, named after the trope in fiction of having like these shallow black characters with magic powers that defines their whole being.
Yeah. We're trying to get out of that. And doing a good job of it. You know?
I think that the thing that has always most interested me when it comes to science fiction, fantasy, and horror is the places where these larger-than-life or superpowered characters are vulnerable and human, because that contrast really interests me.
All right, and do you have a website?
Yes, alexjennings.net.
Very easy. Well, I will definitely be following you and your career, and I am super duper looking forward to continuing the story of Perry, Peaches, and Brandy, and I hope to read many more.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And it's been Titles, Talk, and Tipples with Alex Jennings. Go get the book.
Tonight's late night story is a strange tale by the author Alex Jennings, who wrote the Ballad of Perilous Graves. This story is called The Leap Test. Lamont had finished setting up the testing room, but it was after 10 now, and he was still by himself. He took a seat in the uncomfortable chair, wincing as its arms dug into his sides, and drew his phone out again. Under normal circumstances, leap testing was an exercise in boredom. The Louisiana Educational Assessment Program was a product of No Child Left Behind. The test was full of questions relating to oil production, and Lamont's eyes nearly crossed just reading them to himself. The office door clattered open before Lamont could check his Twitter feed. Miss Glitz stood in the hallway, festooned with scarves. She was young and blonde, not Lamont's type, but he loved her old lady perfume. For a moment, Lamont thought Glitz was alone in the hall. Then Skander Nunez darted from behind her and into the room, as if across the finish line. Small for his age, Skander had enormous brown eyes and a mass of curly hair so dark it looked wet. In his left hand, he carried an antique pencil case. "Thank you, Miss Glitz," Lamont said in his too bright teacher voice. Grimacing, Glitz tossed Lamont a wave and turned abruptly away. She shut the door behind her. "Good morning, Skander." "Jury's still out," the third grader said. "What have we got today?" The boy checked the room's sight lines and repositioned his chair to make sure he had an easy view of the door, but he did so mechanically, as if from habit. Lamont didn't answer Skander's question until the boy had taken a seat. "Leap testing," he said. "English language arts." "Oh, for fuck's sake," Skander spat. "Language. Fill it out yourself." "Too wrong," Skander said. "You know I can't do that." "Don't talk to me like I'm one of them," Skander said. "Your slip is showing," Lamont said. "My what?" Skander said. "I'm 8. "You're 9, Lamont said, "and you know good and well." Skander rolled his eyes. "Here it comes. If you're going to live here on Earth, you're to live as a human child of your apparent age. If you can't do that, you can go to a removal community and try integration again later. You don't have to be here." "Don't I?" Skander said. "Removal community. Listen to yourself. I've tried that, and so did you. At least when I'm here, I get to take nights and weekends off. It's not a never-ending fucking summer camp." "That's unfair." "Well, then excuse me," Skander returned. This sentence contained no profanity, but it was the first one he'd spoken with genuine venom. "Things are improving." "Just read a question," Skander said, dismissive. "It goes with a story." "Well, read me the story then." "A Rousing Success," Lamont read, by Abram Schulman. One morning, Karen's mother visited Karen's room to wake her before school. Karen had a difficult time waking up because nobody let her have a decent cup of coffee, Skander finished. "I drink cold brew." He curled a bicep and switched to a cartoonish Russian accent. "Make me strong like bull." "That'll stunt your growth," Lamont said. "Half the time we talk, I'm asking myself, is he fucking with me or is he really that dumb?" "I'm sure it's a little of both," Lamont said. Skander watched him for a long time. Lamont fidgeted a little. He liked this feeling. It was as if they were waiting to see who would laugh first. When Skander's expression broke, no mirth appeared. Instead, his face seemed to crumble, and for the first time, his age showed. "Tell me, honestly, how did you do it?" he said. "You were how old before you came back?" Lamont didn't usually talk about his sojourn, but there was no denying the desperation in the boy's voice. "In Fornes, I served the royal court for 115 years, he said. "It's hard to say how long I was there before I took the position, but we had to organize a resistance and overthrow Fel Malik. I was a grown man by the time we rooted out the last of his altar stones. By his reckoning, he'd been at least 32 when he joined the court." "That's a long life," Skander said. "Wife? Kids?" "2 wives," Lamont said. 6 children. "And once you came back, you were..." 11, Lamont said. "It was 1994. I had to finish middle and high school, go to college." He didn't have to explain. He'd been a fat kid in South Baltimore, and his adventures had rendered him terminally strange. The other kids despised him. Even the despised kids despised him. "After more than a century as a hero of a hidden realm," Skander said. Lamont swallowed. A knock at the door. "Go away," Skander called. "We're playing spades." Lamont glared at him. "What is it?" Miss Blitz opened the door partway and craned her neck to face him. "Did Shauna leave some folders in here?" Lamont glanced around the little room. It depressed him a little that on normal days this was someone's office. "Not that I see. Was it put away or on the desk?" She paused before answering, questioning Lamont with a look. Lamont's shrug was barely a movement. Glitz drew in a breath. Lamont hardened his gaze. "Couldn't tell you," Glitz said. "You know, Shauna, sorry to interrupt." She withdrew again, shutting the door. "Isn't that illegal?" Skander asked. "Isn't what?" "Interrupting testing," Skander said. "She could have given me an answer sheet or threatened me in code or something." "You should be nicer to her," Lamont said. "She's one of the good ones. She's not even trying to get you to be normal. She just wants you to pass so that average people will think you're one of their own and treat you accordingly." "That makes her worse than the others," Skander said tightly. "If we were as similar as you think, you'd get that. You shouldn't speak that way to me, to anyone. Report me. Not unless you force me." "My father's terrified of me," Skander said. "He thinks I'm an imposter. He knows I'm not, but he can't help himself." "My mother died believing I'd murdered her son and replaced him," Lamont said. "We only spoke of it once." "You were close?" "Before I crossed." "My father used to beat me," Skander said. "He tried once after I got back. I didn't stop him. I just kept eye contact. After a while, the fear froze his hands and he had to give up. Genuine pity is the direct and most powerful magic at our disposal." They paused just long enough for Lamont to take in what they'd just said. They both laughed. "Okay, maybe you should talk to me like you talk to them," Skander said with real affection. He leaned forward, pushed his fingers into his hair. "I'm not married. Wasn't married." Now it was his turn to swallow. "The worst thing is, I'd forgotten, you know. Film changed my memories when I arrived. Gave me a backstory, a family history, everything. I had to alter time itself to bring Prime Minister Skarn back from the underworld. It was in the naming world, trying to fuse the right colors together, when I saw a color I'd never seen before, one that didn't belong. I tried not to touch it because I knew it was mine. I suspected from the start that there was more to the amnesia than a head injury. I fixed the streams, restored Minister Skarn to life, and made it so the invasion never happened. That night, I went back to Belm a hero. I didn't think anyone would know what I'd done, but..." He trailed off. "How did they find out?" Lamont asked. "Remenda, the Birch Queen, had been killed just before I traversed the world. She was dead the entire time I was in there, and she saw it all from beyond. Well, except for the part where I realized I wasn't me. So once she was alive again, we sued for marriage. I was 36. Tell me about her." "No," Skander said. "No, the word is the same, but birches are different there. They're made of stone glass, and they smell like a cross between vanilla and lavender. She was the color of cola when the sun shines through it. I won't tell you about her." He slapped his pencil case down on the desk. "Goddamn leap tests," he said. "Menda and I didn't have kids." "Listen," Lamont said, "I know it's hard, I know, but there's more at stake here than you realize. You've got to work with me." "I know you mean well," Skander said. "I get why Delgado wants us to live this way. You can't have people crossing the water to and fro all the time. It would disrupt the fabric of reality. Hell, did you read Scriver's new paper? He thinks the hidden realms are created when we cross and destroyed when we cross back. He says that's why nobody's ever returned to one." "I don't believe that," Lamont said. "Your wives? Your kids?" Lamont didn't answer. "I don't believe it either," Skander said. "In fact, I know it's not true." "Don't say what you're going to say," Lamont warned. "Write your test, do well enough, and live your life." "Or what?" Skander said. "You'll take that wand you have taped to the bottom of the desk drawer and cut me down in the middle of the elementary school day? How is that a guy like you has to resort to that kind of violence to keep me in line? A wand? Pathetic." "I'm going to tell you something real," Lamont said. "It's not the Delgado party line, and it's not coming from your integration officer. I say this man to man. The life you led is so crazy that it's thrown off your understanding of this world and how it works. You can't conceive that there's anyone tougher, quicker, or luckier than you. You can't imagine that anyone has been through what you've been through and done things any differently. You may have lived into your 30s before you left that other world behind, but you've got a lot of growing up to do. I can get you back to Forness, Skander said flatly. Silence filled the air of the small office. It settled heavily over them like a blanket of years and pain. God damn it, Lamont said. As soon as he made to reach under the desk, he became aware that he and Skander were not alone in the room. Another version of Skander leaned against the wall by the window. His arms crossed as he waited. Another sat on the floor to the right of the desk, his back against the wall. A third stood beside the door, his eyes boring into Lamont. Wands are for, Skander said. Now a hum had entered the air of the room. Something electric seemed to disturb it. Electric and ancient. I'm sorry, Lamont, Skander said. We'll both... He pitched forward, went to his knees. With his left hand he reached for his throat. Panic filled his eyes as he realized he was sinking into the floor. He locked eyes with Lamont. Lamont showed the boy his palms. There was nothing he could do. In another moment he was gone, and so were his projections. Lamont sighed. You're right, he said. Wands are for kids. This was the part of the job he hated. He loved these kids, understood their pain, but more often than not, they understood nothing beyond it. Most of them grew up again just fine, but others? The loss of everything they knew or cared for embittered them, twisted their minds, led them to lash out against innocent people or even entire worlds. I can get you back to Forness. Another knock at the door. Lamont waited a moment, then stood and crossed the room to let Glitz and her pressed flower scent inside. This time she closed the door behind her. It's done, she said. It wasn't a question. Honestly, I don't want to talk about it. You're going to have to file a report anyway, Lamont sighed. You were right. It was Scriber's paper. Pushed him over the edge. Lamont shook his head. He hated lying to these kids, but he understood the necessity. If a crosser learned that it was possible to return before he or she had finished working through the trauma of being bounced back to baseline reality, they could seriously endanger themselves, this plane, and their adopted realms. Listen, I know he was your favorite. Just talk to Cherish. Take some time off. You know, sooner or later one of those Dark Lords is going to follow a kid back here. Who's going to stop them if that happens? Crazy fucked up kids like Skander used to be. Or those basket case camp kids. Lamont shook his head. Lamont, Glitz repeated. She waited until he looked her in the eye. They're not camps. Don't call them that. Definitely not to anyone besides me. Understand? Lamont couldn't speak. All he could offer her was a half nod. Nobody's coming, Glitz said, and even if they were, it wouldn't be our job to deal with that. We're integrators. Right. Go home, have a good cry, she said. Then in 2 weeks, get your ass back here for another test. If this is so easy for you, why did you interrupt us? Glitz took a breath and seemed to weigh her response. Finally, she said, because I knew if you stayed in here with him too long, you'd lose your nerve. Now go. Tell Rana and Chile hide for me. Kiss the kids. Lamont tried to resist, but he cracked a genuine smile. I will, he said. I always do. And that was The Leap Test by Alexjennings, the author of the Ballad of Perilous Graves, which is available now in hardback, soon in paperback, and in audiobook and Kindle. Go check it out. It's a fantastic book by a fantastic writer. Have a good night. Dreadful dreams.